The windshield wipers fought against the snow like desperate hands clawing at a white wall. I could barely see 10 feet ahead as my old Honda struggled through another drift, the engine whining in protest. My knuckles were white against the steering wheel, and every muscle in my body ached from the tension of driving through what the Weather Service had called the worst blizzard in a decade. But I kept going because today was Thanksgiving, and despite everything, they were still my family. So before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 hours into what should have been a 90-minute drive, my phone buzzed against the passenger seat. I pulled over, hazard lights blinking weakly in the storm, and saw my daughter-in-law Chelsea's name on the screen. My heart lifted for just a moment, thinking maybe she was calling to check if I was okay, if I needed help getting through the storm. Mary? Her voice was crisp, efficient, like she was checking items off a to-do list. Where are you? We're getting ready to eat. I glanced at the clock on my dashboard. It was barely past noon. I'm about an hour out, sweetheart. This storm is terrible, but I'm pushing through. Can you tell Marcus I'll be there soon? There was a pause, and in that silence I heard laughter in the background, the clink of glasses, the warm sounds of family gathering. Then Chelsea's voice cut through it all like ice. Oh, Mary, we already ate without you. The turkey was getting cold, and honestly, we didn't think you'd make it. The words hit me harder than the wind battering my car. You already ate? Well, yes, it's Thanksgiving. We can't wait all day. Her tone was so casual, so dismissive, like she was explaining why the sky was blue. But there might be some leftovers when you get here. My throat closed up. I'd been driving for 3 hours through a blizzard, white-knuckling it through conditions that had most people staying home, all to be with them for Thanksgiving dinner, our family tradition. The meal I'd been looking forward to for weeks. I see, I managed to whisper. Great, drive safe, okay? See you soon. The line went dead. I sat there in my car, snow piling up on the windshield, staring at the phone in my lap. The silence was deafening. Not even Marcus had gotten on the phone. My own son, who I'd raised alone after his father died, who I'd worked 2 jobs to put through college, couldn't be bothered to speak to his mother, who was fighting through a storm to be with him. But just as I was about to put the car in reverse and turn around, something inside me refused to give up. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. Maybe when I got there, they'd realize how terrible this was, and we could laugh about it later. Maybe my son still had some love left for the woman who'd sacrificed everything to give him a good life. I was born Meredith Chapman, but everyone called me Mary, and for most of my 58 years, the nickname had fit like a comfortable sweater. I was the kind of person who brought homemade cookies to new neighbors, who remembered everyone's birthday, who volunteered at the animal shelter every Saturday morning. Even after David died 7 years ago, leaving me with a mountain of medical debt and a broken heart, I'd managed to keep that spark alive. I had to. Marcus needed me to be strong. David's cancer had been brutal, not just on him, but on all of us. I'd taken leave from my job as a school librarian to care for him, burning through our savings and retirement fund to pay for treatments insurance wouldn't cover. When he passed, I was left with nothing but debt and memories, but I told myself it was worth it. We'd fought together until the end, and that had to count for something. Marcus was 25 then, fresh out of graduate school with his MBA, and I was so proud of him. He landed a job at a tech startup in Chicago, making more money than David and I had ever dreamed of. When he called to tell me about the salary, I cried happy tears in my empty kitchen, thinking about how his father would have been bursting with pride. 6 months later, he brought Chelsea home. She was beautiful in that polished, expensive way that made you immediately aware of your own flaws. Blonde hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place, designer clothes that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, and a smile that was perfect and cold as winter sunlight. She worked in marketing for some high-end fashion brand, had an apartment in the trendy part of the city, and spoke about money like it was water, abundant and always flowing. The first time I met her, she'd looked around my modest ranch house with the kind of careful expression people use when they're trying not to let their disappointment show. "It's so cozy," she'd said. which I was beginning to understand was rich person speak for small and outdated. But I tried. God, how I tried to win her over. I learned to make her favorite foods, bought expensive wine for when they visited, even took on extra tutoring jobs to save up for nicer gifts at Christmas and birthdays. When they got engaged, I spent nearly $2,000 I didn't have on their engagement party, maxing out my last credit card because I wanted Marcus to be proud of his mother. The wedding was a different story entirely. Chelsea's parents owned a chain of luxury hotels, and the celebration reflected their wealth in every crystal chandelier and imported flower arrangement. I felt like a fraud in my department store dress, smiling and nodding as people discussed vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines. But watching Marcus in his tuxedo, seeing him happy, made all the discomfort worth it. Or, so I thought. The changes started slowly after they married. Phone calls became shorter and less frequent. Visits to my house stopped altogether, replaced by obligations to meet them at expensive restaurants where I'd study the menu prices with growing anxiety. When I suggested they come to me for holidays, Chelsea would always have some excuse. The guest room wasn't quite ready, or they'd already made reservations somewhere special, or her parents expected them at the country club. I should have seen the pattern forming, but love makes you blind to a lot of things. I kept telling myself they were just busy building their lives together, that once they settled down, things would go back to normal. I made excuses for every missed birthday call, every canceled plan, every holiday spent alone while they posted pictures from exotic vacations or intimate dinners with Chelsea's family. The real wake-up call came last Christmas. I'd saved for months to buy them a weekend getaway to a bed and breakfast in Vermont, something I thought they'd enjoy together. When I gave them the gift certificate, Chelsea's face went through a series of expressions that ended in barely concealed horror. "Oh, Mary," she'd said, holding the envelope like it might contaminate her manicured fingers. "This is so thoughtful, but we really don't do quaint places. Maybe you could return it and get something for yourself?" Marcus had said nothing, not one word in defense of the gift or his mother's feelings. He just stared at his phone while his wife casually destroyed something I'd worked extra shifts to afford. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, finally admitting to myself what I'd been fighting for 2 years. I was becoming an embarrassment to them. My small house, my modest income, my simple pleasures, they were all reminders of a life Chelsea found distasteful, and Marcus was eager to leave behind. But even knowing all this, even understanding that I'd somehow become the obligation they endured, rather than the family they loved, I couldn't give up. Marcus was still my son. David's son. The little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who made me Mother's Day cards from construction paper, and wrote that I was the best mom in the world in his careful second-grade handwriting. So when Chelsea called last week to invite me to Thanksgiving dinner at their new house, I said yes without hesitation. She mentioned it was going to be a small gathering, just family, and for a tour.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Moment I felt that old warmth, that sense of belonging I'd been missing for so long. I should have known better. The storm had started Wednesday evening, just as I was finishing my preparations for the trip. I'd made Marcus's favorite pumpkin bread, the recipe his grandmother had passed down to me when David and I first married. I'd wrapped it carefully in foil and placed it next to the bottle of wine I'd splurged on, a vintage that had cost me a week's worth of groceries but that I hoped would show Chelsea I wasn't completely hopeless when it came to sophisticated things. The weather reports were ominous. Meteorologists used words like, quote, unprecedented and life-threatening, advising people to stay home unless absolutely necessary. But this was Thanksgiving. This was my chance to rebuild the bridge that seemed to be crumbling between my son and me. A little snow wasn't going to stop me from being there. I packed an overnight bag, just in case the roads were too dangerous for the return trip, and set my alarm for 5 in the morning. If I left early enough, I reasoned, I could beat the worst of the storm and be there in time to help with the cooking. Maybe Chelsea would appreciate the extra hands, and we could have one of those bonding moments I'd been hoping for. The morning came dark and brutal. Snow was already falling heavily when I scraped off my car and loaded my gifts into the back seat. The radio announcer was practically begging people to stay home, but I'd already made up my mind. I'd driven through plenty of storms before. Growing up in Minnesota had taught me how to handle winter weather, and my little Honda, while not fancy, was reliable. The first hour wasn't too bad. Traffic was light, probably because most people had the sense to stay home, and I made decent time despite the snow. I even allowed myself to feel a little proud of my decision. I'd be there early, maybe even before Chelsea was fully awake, and I could help set up for dinner, prove that I was useful, wanted, needed. But by the second hour, the storm had intensified beyond anything I'd ever experienced. The wind howled across the highway like something alive and angry, pushing my small car around like a toy. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I found myself gripping the wheels so tightly my hands cramped. Other cars had disappeared from the road entirely, leaving me alone with the storm and my determination to reach my family. I should have turned around. Any reasonable person would have found the nearest exit, checked into a hotel, and waited for the weather to pass. But I wasn't being reasonable. I was being a mother who'd spent 2 years watching her relationship with her only child deteriorate, who saw this invitation as maybe her last chance to remind him that family meant something. So I pushed on through drifts that nearly swallowed my car, through winds that screamed like banshees, through a storm that wanted nothing more than to send me sliding off the road into some frozen ditch where they might not find me until spring. And all the while I kept thinking about the warm house waiting for me, the family dinner, the chance to feel like I belonged somewhere again. The phone call from Chelsea had shattered that fantasy more effectively than any crash could have. Sitting there in my car, snow building up around me like a tomb, I finally understood the truth I'd been avoiding. This wasn't about the weather or bad timing. This was about them moving on without me, literally and figuratively. They'd eaten without me because they didn't really want me there in the first place. The invitation had been a courtesy, nothing more. A way to say they'd asked so they couldn't be accused of excluding me entirely. They'd probably hoped the storm would give me an excuse not to come, would solve their problem without them having to be the bad guys. But I was already here, wasn't I? 3 hours into a nightmare drive, covered in road salt and determination, with homemade pumpkin bread and expensive wine in my back seat. I'd come this far through conditions that had closed highways and sent smarter people home to their warm living rooms. I wasn't turning back now. The last hour of the drive was pure hell. The storm had reached the point where I couldn't tell where the road ended and the world began. Everything was white, howling, hostile. My car's heating system struggled against the cold, seeping through every seal and joint, and my breath started to fog the windows, despite the defroster running at full blast. Twice I nearly slid off the road entirely, saved only by luck and whatever guardian angel looks after stubborn mothers driving through blizzards to reach children who don't really want to see them. My phone had lost signal miles back, leaving me alone with the storm and my thoughts, which had grown increasingly dark as the miles crawled by. What was I doing this for? What was I trying to prove? That I was tough enough to handle anything? That my love for Marcus was stronger than any storm? Or was I just too proud to admit that maybe I didn't belong in their life anymore? That maybe it was time to accept that my son had outgrown his mother, along with everything else from his old life? By the time I finally saw the exit for their subdivision, I was running on pure stubbornness and whatever fumes were left in my gas tank. The roads in their neighborhood were completely unplowed, pristine white except for the tire tracks of whoever had been foolish enough to venture out before me. Their house, when I finally found it, glowed warmly through the snow, windows golden with light and life. I sat in my car for a moment, engine running, gathering the courage to walk up to that front door. Through the window I could see movement, shadows of people moving around inside. My family. The people I'd risked my life to see, who couldn't be bothered to wait for me before starting their celebration. The cold hit me like a physical blow when I opened the car door. Snow immediately began filling my shoes as I struggled to the back seat for my gifts, the wind trying to tear the carefully wrapped packages from my frozen fingers. By the time I reached their front porch, I was covered in snow and shaking so hard I could barely ring the doorbell. Chelsea answered the door wearing a cream-colored cashmere sweater that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. Her makeup was perfect, her hair styled like she was expecting a photographer, and when she saw me standing there looking like the abominable snowman, her smile faltered for just a moment before snapping back into place. "Mary, you made it! We were so worried about you." She stepped aside to let me in, but her tone was the same one you'd use to greet an unexpected door-to-door salesman. Polite but distant, going through the motions. The warmth of their house enveloped me like a hug I desperately needed. I could smell turkey and stuffing, cinnamon and wine, all the scents that should have meant home and family and belonging. But underneath the warmth was something else, something that made my stomach clench with dread. "Where's Marcus?" I asked, struggling out of my snow-soaked coat. "Oh, he's in the living room with everyone else. They're watching football." She took my coat with the tips of her fingers, holding it away from her expensive sweater like it might leave stains. "You look frozen. Why don't you go warm up by the fire?" "Everyone else?" The words hit me like another blast of cold wind. This was supposed to be a small family gathering, just the three of us. But as I followed Chelsea deeper into the house, I could hear multiple voices, laughter, the sounds of a party in full swing. The living room was full of people I didn't recognize. Beautiful people in expensive clothes, holding crystal glasses and speaking in the kind of low, cultured tones that suggested money and education, and a world I'd never really been part of. Chelsea's parents were there, her father distinguished in his sweater vest, her mother elegant in silk. Her brother and his wife had made it despite the storm, along with what looked like several family friends. And there, in the middle of it all, was my son. Marcus had his back to me when I entered, gesturing with a wine glass as he told some story that had the group chuckling appreciatively. He'd grown more polished over the years, more like Chelsea's people than the boy I'd raised. His hair was perfectly styled, his clothes expensive and carefully chosen. When he finally turned and saw me, standing there dripping snow and clutching my humble gifts, something flickered across his face too quickly for me to identify. "Mom," he said, and I heard it then, the slight tone of surprise and maybe something else. Disappointment? Resignation? "You actually made it. Actually made it." Like, my arrival was some kind of minor miracle, rather than the result of a mother's determination to be with her family on Thanksgiving. "Of course I made it," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "I told you I would be here." Chelsea appeared at my elbow with a towel. "You must be exhausted after that drive. Why don't you sit down and I'll get you something warm to drink?" I wanted to say yes, wanted to sink into one of their expensive chairs and let someone take care of me for a few minutes. But I also wanted to give Marcus his gift, wanted to see his face when he opened the pumpkin bread I'd made specially for him. "I brought some things," I said, holding up the bag that contained the bread and wine. "Oh, how thoughtful," Chelsea said in that bright, empty tone she used when she was trying to be polite. "Marcus, why don't you help your mother with her things?" But Marcus was already turning back to his conversation, dismissing me with a casual wave. "Just put it in the kitchen, Mom. We'll look at it later." Just put it in the kitchen. Like I was the delivery person dropping off an order, not his mother who'd driven through a blizzard to be with him. I followed Chelsea to the kitchen, which was a masterpiece of granite and stainless steel that probably cost more than I made in a year. The remnants of their Thanksgiving feast were scattered across the counters, evidence of the meal I'd missed while fighting through the storm to get here. "The turkey was beautiful," Chelsea said, as if reading my thoughts. "Mom's recipe. Marcus said it was the best he'd ever had." She smiled as she said it, but there was something sharp underneath, something that made me wonder if she was deliberately twisting the knife. I set my bag on the counter next to a pile of dirty dishes and empty wine bottles. "I'm sorry I missed dinner. The storm was worse than I expected." "Oh, don't worry about it. These things happen." She opened the refrigerator and began pulling out containers. "There's plenty left. Turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce. I can make you a plate." Leftovers. After driving 3 hours through hell to be here, I was being offered leftovers like a stray dog who'd wandered up to the back door. "That's very kind," I managed to say, though the words tasted like ash in my mouth. As Chelsea busied herself with heating up my sad portion of their celebration, I unpacked my gifts. The wine looked pitiful next to the expensive bottles that lined their counter, and the pumpkin bread, wrapped in my careful foil, seemed homemade in the worst possible way. "Oh, you brought wine," Chelsea said, glancing at the bottle. "How nice. We're actually drinking champagne tonight, celebrating Marcus's promotion, but I'm sure someone will appreciate this later." Marcus's promotion. Another milestone in my son's life that I was learning about after the fact, from his wife, while standing in their kitchen being served reheated turkey. "He got promoted?" I asked, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice. "Last week. Regional vice president. Isn't that wonderful?" "We found out Tuesday, which is why Mom and Dad were able to fly in for dinner. It was all very last minute." Last minute? The invitation that I'd thought was about including me in their family tradition had actually been about Chelsea's family celebrating Marcus's success. I was the afterthought, the obligation they'd felt compelled to include but hoped wouldn't actually show up. The microwave beeped, and Chelsea set a plate in front of me with the kind of smile you give to a child who's been particularly trying. "There you go. I hope it's still good." I stared down at the small portions of food that represented my Thanksgiving dinner, my family celebration, my place in my son's life. Everything looked wilted and reheated, lacking the warmth and love that should have filled this meal. "Thank you," I whispered, because what else could I say? "I should get back to our guests," Chelsea said, already moving toward the door. "Take your time. Make yourself at home. Make yourself at home." In the kitchen, while they entertained their real family in the living room, I sat alone at their breakfast bar, picking at my lukewarm turkey and listening to the sounds of celebration from the next room. I could hear Marcus's voice rising above the others, telling stories, making people laugh, being the charming host. The son I'd raised to be kind and thoughtful and loyal had grown into a man who could let his mother sit alone in the kitchen on Thanksgiving, eating leftovers while he entertained people who mattered more than she did. The pumpkin bread sat unopened on the counter, forgotten like everything else I'd brought to this gathering. The expensive wine I'd sacrificed groceries to buy would probably end up in their pantry, saved for a special occasion that would never include me. I should have left then, should have quietly gathered my things and slipped out the back door. Let them continue their celebration without the uncomfortable reminder of Marcus's humble beginnings sitting in their kitchen. But something kept me in that chair. Something stubborn and hurting and desperate for one moment of recognition from the son I'd given everything to raise. So I finished my reheated dinner and tried to pretend that this was normal, that families did this to each other all the time, that love could survive this kind of casual cruelty, this thoughtless dismissal of sacrifice and devotion. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't about the storm or bad timing or miscommunication. This was about who I was in their world now, and who I would never be. I was the past they'd rather forget, the reminder of a simpler life they'd outgrown, the mother who no longer fit into the sophisticated image they'd built for themselves. And as I sat there in their beautiful kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of their success and my irrelevance, I finally understood that some bridges, once burned, can never be rebuilt. Some relationships, once broken, can never be repaired with homemade bread and good intentions, and the desperate love of a mother who refuses to give up. The sound of laughter from the living room washed over me like waves, and I closed my eyes, wondering how I'd ended up here, wondering if this was how it would always be from now on, wondering if the little boy who used to need me so desperately had really disappeared forever, replaced by this stranger who could feast with friends while his mother ate alone in the kitchen, forgotten and dismissed like yesterday's news. But as I sat there drowning in my own sorrow and the bitter taste of cold turkey, I had no idea that everything was about to change, that the storm that had nearly killed me getting here was about to bring something unexpected through their front door, something that would shift the balance of power in ways I never could have imagined. The doorbell rang. The doorbell's chime cut through the house like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. I heard Chelsea's heels clicking rapidly across the hardwood floor, her voice bright with curiosity as she called out, "Now who could that be in this weather?" From my perch in the kitchen, I watched through the doorway as she opened the front door. A blast of cold air swept through the house, carrying with it swirls of snow and the silhouette of a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, maybe in his early 50s, with silver threading through dark hair and wearing an expensive-looking coat that somehow made him appear dignified, rather than disheveled, despite the storm raging behind him. "I'm so sorry to bother you," he said, his voice carrying a warm authority that seemed to fill the entire entryway. "My car broke down about half a mile from here, and I was wondering if I could use your phone to call for help. My cell service seems to be out." Chelsea's demeanor shifted instantly from confusion to the kind of gracious hostility she reserved for unexpected situations. "Oh my goodness, of course. Please, come in. Out of the cold. You must be freezing." As the strangers stepped into their foyer, shaking snow from his shoulders, Marcus appeared from the living room with several of the other guests trailing behind him. There was something about moments like these that drew people. The drama of rescue and unexpected visitors breaking the comfortable predictability of planned gatherings. "Car trouble?" Marcus asked, extending his hand in greeting. "That's rough in this weather. I'm Marcus, by the way." The man accepted the handshake with a slight smile. "Daniel Morrison. And thank you for your hospitality. I know it's an imposition, especially during what appears to be a family gathering." Daniel Morrison. Something about the name tickled the back of my memory, but I couldn't quite place it. I remained seated at the breakfast bar, feeling oddly invisible as the drama unfolded in the next room. "Nonsense," Chelsea said, though I could hear the strain in her voice. Having an uninvited guest, even one forced by circumstances, was clearly not part of her perfectly orchestrated evening. "Can I get you some coffee? Something to warm you up?" "That's very kind, but I don't want to impose any more than necessary. If I could just make a quick call." Of course, of course. "Marcus, why don't you show Mr. Morrison to the study? The phone in there will give you some privacy." But as they moved toward the hallway, Daniel Morrison's gaze swept across the open floor plan of their home, taking in the elegant furnishings, the crystal, the obvious wealth on display. His eyes moved past the living room, past the dining area with its abandoned feast, and landed squarely on me sitting alone in the kitchen. He stopped walking. For a moment, the busy chatter of the group fell silent as they followed his gaze. I felt heat rise in my cheeks as I became acutely aware of how I must look, the storm-bedraggled woman eating leftovers while the real family entertained in the other room. "Excuse me," Daniel said quietly, his attention entirely focused on me now. "Meredith? Meredith Chapman?" The use of my full name sent a shock through my system. Nobody called me Meredith anymore except for official documents and telemarketers. I set down my fork, my heart beginning to pound with a rhythm I couldn't quite understand. "Yes?" I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled then, a genuine expression that transformed his entire face and made me realize why he'd seemed familiar. "It really is you." My God, after all these years. The room had gone completely silent now. I could feel every eye on me, could sense the confusion and curiosity radiating from Marcus and Chelsea and their guests. But all I could focus on was the man walking toward me with recognition shining in his eyes. "I'm sorry," I said, standing up from my stool on unsteady legs. "I'm afraid I don't remember." "Daniel Morrison," he said again, stopping just a few feet away from me. "Though I suppose I look different than I did 22 years ago. I was Danny then. Danny Morrison from your reading group at the Millfield Library." The words hit me like another blast of Arctic wind. Millfield Library. My first job out of college, the tiny branch library in the industrial part of town where I'd worked before Marcus was born. The reading group I'd started for at-risk teenagers, kids from the projects and broken homes who needed somewhere safe to go after school. And Danny Morrison, sweet, angry, brilliant Danny with the bruised knuckles and the chip on his shoulder the size of Lake Michigan. The kid who'd slouched into my reading group with a court order and an attitude, who'd been arrested for vandalism and sentenced to community service. "Danny?" I breathed, and suddenly I could see him clearly. The sharp cheekbones were the same, the intelligent eyes that had always seemed too old for his 17-year-old face. My God, Danny Morrison. His smile widened. And for a moment he looked exactly like that teenager who discovered he loved books almost as much as he loved being angry at the world. "You remember?" "Of course I remember. You read everything I put in front of you. Steinbeck, Morrison, Baldwin. You wrote that essay about the outsiders that made me cry. You kept that essay," he said softly. "You told me it was the best thing you'd ever read from someone my age." The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. Danny Morrison, the kid everyone had given up on, writing with passion and insight about belonging and family, and the ways society throws away the people it doesn't understand. I'd submitted that essay to a local writing contest without telling him, and when he'd won third place, he'd cried in my office. "You changed my life," he said now, his voice carrying the weight of decades. "Do you know that? You saw something in me when nobody else could. When everyone else just saw a juvenile delinquent, you saw a writer." I felt my own eyes filling with tears, overwhelmed by the memory and the impossible coincidence of him standing in this kitchen in this house, on this terrible night. "What happened to you?" After the program ended, I always wondered. "College," he said. "Northwestern, actually. Journalism degree, then law school. You told me I had a voice worth developing, remember? So I developed it." Behind us, I could hear the murmur of confused conversation, as Marcus and Chelsea tried to process what they were witnessing. Their forgotten mother was apparently not as unremarkable as they'd assumed. "Law school," I repeated, still struggling to reconcile the successful man in front of me with the troubled teenager from my memory. "Danny, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you." His expression grew more serious. "I tried to find you, you know. After I graduated, after I passed the bar. I wanted to thank you properly, wanted you to know what you'd done for me. But you'd left Millfield, and the library said they couldn't give out personal information. I got married," I explained. "My name changed, and we moved here when David got his job at the plant." "David?" He nodded. "Your husband. Is he here tonight?" The question hung in the air, and I felt the familiar stab of grief that still caught me off guard sometimes. "David passed away 7 years ago. Cancer." Daniel's face fell. "I'm so sorry, Meredith. He was lucky to have you." "I was the lucky one," I said quietly. "And this must be your son," Daniel said, turning toward Marcus, who had been standing frozen in the doorway throughout our entire exchange. "You used to talk about him all the time. Little Marcus, who was going to change the world." Marcus stepped forward, looking shell-shocked. "You know my mother?" "Know her?" Daniel laughed, but there was something fierce in the sound. "Your mother saved my life. Literally saved my life. I was headed for prison or worse when she pulled me into that reading group and showed me I had value." Chelsea appeared at Marcus's side, her face a mask of polite confusion. "How wonderful," she said in that bright, empty tone. "Small world, isn't it?" Daniel turned to look at her, and I saw his expression shift subtly. The warmth remained, but something calculating entered his eyes as he took in the scene more fully. The expensive house, the formal dinner party, and me, sitting alone in the kitchen with a plate of reheated food. "I'm sorry," he said carefully. "I don't want to interrupt your family gathering. I can see you're in the middle of dinner." "Oh, we've finished," Chelsea said quickly. "We eat early on holidays. Family tradition." "Family tradition," Daniel repeated, his gaze moving between Chelsea, Marcus, and me. "And Meredith was?" "Mom got caught in the storm," Marcus said, his voice defensive. "We couldn't wait indefinitely." The silence that followed was deafening. I watched Daniel's face as he processed the situation, saw the exact moment when understanding dawned. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and when he looked at me again, there was something new in his expression, something protective and angry. "I see," he said, quietly. "Well, I suppose weather can be unpredictable. Very unpredictable," Chelsea agreed, missing entirely the undercurrent of tension that had entered the conversation. Daniel turned back to me, and his voice was gentle again. "Meredith, I still need to make that phone call about my car, but would you mind if we talked more after that? I have so much I want to tell you." Of course, I said, though my voice came out barely above a whisper. I was still reeling from the impossibility of it all, from having this ghost from my past materialize just when I needed a reminder that I'd once mattered to someone. Marcus, Daniel said, addressing my son directly. Would it be possible to use that phone now? Sure, absolutely. Right this way. As they disappeared into the study, Chelsea turned to me with questions written all over her face. Well, that was unexpected. How do you know him? I used to work with troubled teens, I said, not wanting to get into the full story. Danny was one of my kids. One of your kids, she repeated, and I caught the slight emphasis on the word your, as if the idea of me having any influence on someone else's life was vaguely absurd. Yes, I said firmly. One of my kids. From the study, I could hear the low murmur of Daniel's voice as he made his phone call. The rest of the party had gradually drifted back to the living room, but I remained in the kitchen, my mind spinning with memories and possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. 22 years. He'd been looking for me for 22 years. When Daniel returned a few minutes later, his expression was grim. No luck with the tow truck. Everything shut down because of the storm. Looks like I'll be stuck here until morning, unless someone can give me a ride to a hotel. In this weather? Marcus shook his head. The roads are completely impassable. You'd never make it. Chelsea's smile grew noticeably strained. Well, we have a guest room upstairs. It's the least we can do under the circumstances. That's very generous, Daniel said. I promise I'll be out of your way first thing in the morning. Nonsense, Marcus said, though I could hear the effort it took to sound gracious. Any friend of Mom's is welcome here. Any friend of Mom's. The phrase hung in the air like a challenge, and I wondered if Marcus realized what he'd just said. When was the last time he'd acknowledged that I might have friends worth welcoming? Actually, Daniel said, looking directly at me, I was hoping Meredith and I could catch up properly. It's been so many years, and there's so much I want to tell her about what's happened since the reading group. Of course, Chelsea said quickly. Why don't you two use the living room? We were just about to move to the den anyway, weren't we, Marcus? It was a dismissal disguised as hospitality, a way to segregate us from the real party while still appearing accommodating. But Daniel seemed to see right through it. Actually, he said smoothly, I think I'd prefer somewhere more private. Marcus, would it be all right if your mother and I talked in the study? I have some things to discuss with her that are rather personal. Personal. The word sent a flutter of anxiety through my chest. What could Danny Morrison possibly have to discuss with me that was personal? We hadn't seen each other in over 2 decades. Sure, Marcus said, though he looked puzzled. Make yourselves comfortable. The study was Marcus and Chelsea's shrine to their success. Law books and business journals lined the shelves, interspersed with photographs of their travels and achievements. A massive mahogany desk dominated the room, its surface clear, except for an expensive pen set and a few carefully arranged awards. Daniel closed the door behind us and gestured for me to take one of the leather chairs facing the desk. He remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the room's contents. Impressive, he said finally. Your son has done well for himself. Yes, I agreed. I'm very proud of him. Daniel turned to look at me, and there was something in his expression that made my stomach clench. Are you, Meredith? Are you really proud of the man he's become? The question caught me off guard. Of course I am. Why would you ask that? He was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. Because the Marcus you described to me all those years ago, the little boy you loved so fiercely, would never have let his mother sit alone in the kitchen on Thanksgiving, eating reheated food while he entertained guests in the next room. Heat flooded my cheeks. You don't understand the situation. Don't I? He sat down in the chair across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You drove through a blizzard to be here, didn't you? Risked your life to make it to their dinner, and they'd already eaten without you. The storm was worse than expected, I said weakly. They couldn't wait indefinitely. Meredith. His voice was gentle but firm. Stop making excuses for them. The words hit me like a physical blow. For a moment, I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Couldn't do anything but stare at this man who'd seen through my careful justifications in a matter of minutes. "They're my family," I whispered. "Family doesn't treat each other like that," he said quietly. "You taught me that, remember? In the reading group, when we talked about what family really means. You said family was about showing up for each other, about making sacrifices, about putting love before convenience." I closed my eyes, remembering those discussions, the way I'd tried to help those kids understand that they deserved better than what they'd been given. That was different. Was it? Daniel stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the storm that was still raging. "You know, I never forgot what you told me about your son. You used to light up when you talked about him. You'd say he was going to be a doctor or a teacher, someone who helped people. You said you were raising him to be kind." "He is kind," I said automatically. Daniel turned back to me, and his expression was sad. "Is he, Meredith? Because the man I just met, the one who can afford a house like this but lets his mother drive through a deadly storm to eat leftovers alone in his kitchen, that doesn't seem very kind to me." The truth of his words settled over me like a weight. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend Marcus, wanted to maintain the illusion that everything was fine, but sitting there in that expensive study, with the sounds of laughter drifting from the next room while I'd been banished like an embarrassing relative, I couldn't find the energy for any more lies. "When did it change?" I asked, my voice breaking. "When did he stop being the boy I raised?" Daniel's expression softened. "People change, Meredith. Sometimes they grow into better versions of themselves, and sometimes—" He trailed off, but I could fill in the blanks. "Sometimes they grow into people you don't recognize." "Yeah," he said quietly. "Sometimes they do." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl outside and the distant sounds of the party continuing without us. Finally, Daniel cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I'm really here." My head snapped up. "What do you mean?" "My car didn't break down randomly, Meredith. I mean, it did break down, but not by accident. I was coming here specifically to see you." Confusion clouded my thoughts. "But how did you know I'd be here? How did you even know where to find me?" Daniel smiled, but it was tinged with something that might have been embarrassment. "I've been keeping track of you for years, not in a creepy way," he added quickly. "But your son, Marcus Chapman, he's not exactly a private person. His company has a website, social media presence. It wasn't hard to figure out that Meredith Chapman, his mother, was probably the same Meredith who changed my life all those years ago." "You've been keeping track of me," I repeated, still trying to process what he was telling me. "I told you I tried to find you after law school. Well, I never really stopped trying. And when I finally put the pieces together a few months ago, I realized I had to see you again. I had to tell you what your kindness led to." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, holding it out to me with a slight smile. "Daniel Morrison, senior partner, Morrison, Keller and Associates." I stared at the elegant cardstock, at the address in downtown Chicago, at the impressive title beneath his name. Senior partner? Founding partner, actually. We specialize in civil rights law, advocacy for underprivileged youth, educational reform, everything I learned from you about fighting for the forgotten kids. The business card trembled in my hands. "Danny, this is incredible. You built all of this?" "I built it on the foundation you gave me," he said firmly. "Every case we take, every kid we help, it all traces back to that reading group and the librarian who saw potential in a street punk who'd given up on himself. I can't take credit for your success. You don't get to decide that," he said with a grin that reminded me so much of the teenage Danny I'd known. "I've been waiting 22 years to have this conversation, Meredith. You're going to sit there and let me thank you properly." I laughed, despite myself, despite the emotional turmoil of the evening, despite everything. "You always were stubborn." "I learned from the best." His expression grew more serious. "But there's something else I need to tell you. Something about why I came here tonight specifically." Before he could continue, the study door opened, and Marcus appeared, looking somewhat flustered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but Mom, Chelsea was wondering if you needed anything. A blanket, maybe? You must still be cold from the drive." It was a transparent excuse to check on us, to see what we were discussing in private. I could see the curiosity burning in Marcus's eyes, the need to understand what connection his unremarkable mother could possibly have with this obviously successful man. "Actually," Daniel said, standing up, "I think it would be good if you joined us, Marcus. What I'm about to tell your mother affects you too." Marcus stepped fully into the room, closing the door behind him. "Okay, what's going on?" Daniel looked at me, asking permission with his eyes. I nodded, not sure what else to do. "Your mother probably hasn't told you much about her work at the Millfield Library," Daniel began. "About the reading group she ran for at-risk teenagers." "Not really," Marcus admitted. "I was pretty young then." "Well, I was one of those teenagers. 17, angry, headed for serious trouble. Your mother took me into her program and literally saved my life. But that's not the important part of this story." Daniel paused, seeming to gather himself for whatever came next. "The important part is what happened afterward. Your mother didn't just help me find my way. She also did something incredibly generous. Something I only found out about years later, when I was trying to track her down." I frowned, confused. "What are you talking about, Danny?" "The scholarship, Meredith. The anonymous scholarship that paid for my college education. The one that came with a note saying it was from someone who believed in second chances." The words hung in the air like smoke. I felt the blood drain from my face as the memory came rushing back. The scholarship fund I'd set up using David's life insurance money after he died. The small foundation I'd created to help kids like Danny, kids who had potential but no resources. "How did you—" I began, but my voice failed me. "It took years of detective work," Daniel said gently, "but I eventually traced the funding back to the David Chapman Memorial Foundation, a foundation established by his widow, Meredith Chapman, to provide educational opportunities for disadvantaged youth." Marcus was staring at me now, his face a mask of confusion. "Mom, what is he talking about?" I couldn't answer. Couldn't explain how I'd taken the insurance money that was supposed to secure our future and given most of it away to kids I'd never met. Kids who needed chances I could provide. How I'd kept it secret because I knew it wasn't the practical thing to do, wasn't what a responsible mother should do with money meant to take care of her family. "Your mother," Daniel continued, his voice full of quiet reverence, "didn't just save my life with her kindness. She paid for my education, my future, my entire career. And she did it anonymously, expecting nothing in return." "Is this true?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, still unable to speak. "The foundation is still active," Daniel said. "Still helping kids, still changing lives. And I've been trying for years to find the woman who started it, to tell her what her generosity created." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, setting it on the desk between us. "Morrison, Keller and Associates has handled over 300 cases in the past 15 years. We've helped reform the juvenile justice system in Illinois, established after-school programs in 12 cities, and provided legal aid to thousands of families who couldn't afford representation. We've saved kids from the system, reunited families, fought for educational equity." He opened the folder, revealing newspaper clippings, court documents, photographs of young people in graduation gowns. Every single one of these victories exists because a librarian in Millfield saw something worth saving in an angry teenager, and because his mother had the courage to invest in strangers' futures instead of just her own. Marcus picked up one of the newspaper clippings, a story about a landmark case that had changed how juvenile offenders were treated in the court system. "You did this?" "We did this," Daniel corrected. "My firm, the kids we've helped, the systems we've changed. But it all started with your mother's belief that everyone deserves a second chance." I was crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was showing me. All these years I'd wondered if the scholarship fund had made any real difference. I'd gotten a few thank you letters over the years, but I'd never known the full scope of the impact. "There's more," Daniel said softly. He pulled out another document, this one with official-looking letterhead. Last month, the Illinois State Bar Association voted to give the David Chapman Memorial Foundation their humanitarian award for outstanding service to underserved communities. It's the highest honor they give for charitable work. My hand shook as I took the certificate. David's name, printed in elegant script, alongside words like transformative impact and dedication to justice. They want to present it at a ceremony next month, Daniel continued. They want to honor both the foundation and its founder. They want to honor you, Meredith. I don't understand, Marcus said, his voice strange and distant. Mom, why didn't you ever tell me about any of this? I looked up at my son, this man I'd raised but who suddenly felt like a stranger, and tried to find words that would make him understand. Because it wasn't about recognition, I said finally. It was about doing what was right. Your father had a good life insurance policy, enough to take care of us for a while. But there were kids out there who had nothing, who needed help more than we needed security. But the money, Marcus said, that was our future. My college fund. You got scholarships, I reminded him. Academic scholarships, because you were smart and hardworking. You didn't need David's insurance money for college. But what about your retirement? Your security? I gestured around the expensive study, thinking about the house I'd lost, the life I'd had to rebuild from nothing. I managed. Daniel was watching this exchange with growing understanding, and I could see the pieces clicking into place for him. The reheated dinner, my modest appearance, the way I'd been treated like an afterthought in my own son's home. Marcus, Daniel said carefully, what exactly happened to your mother after she established the foundation? Where is she living now? Marcus shifted uncomfortably. She has a nice apartment downtown. She's doing fine. Define fine, Daniel said, and there was steel in his voice now. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken truths and growing tension. Finally, Marcus spoke. She lost the house a few years ago. Business got slow, and she couldn't keep up with the mortgage. She's been renting since then. And her work? She cleans houses, Marcus said quietly, the words dropping like stones into still water. Daniel went very still. She cleans houses. It's honest work, I said quickly, using the same defense I'd given myself 1,000 times. There's nothing wrong with cleaning houses. Of course there's nothing wrong with it, Daniel said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. But Meredith, you're a trained librarian with a master's degree in education. You ran programs that changed kids' lives. You founded a charitable organization that's transformed hundreds of families. That was a long time ago. That was who you are, he said firmly. And you're telling me that you've been reduced to cleaning other people's houses while your son lives in a mansion and treats you like an inconvenience? It's not like that, Marcus said defensively. Mom chose to give that money away. We didn't ask her to do that. No, Daniel said, turning to face my son fully. But when the consequences of her generosity caught up with her, when she needed help, where were you? Marcus's face flushed red. That's not fair. You don't know the whole situation. Then explain it to me, Daniel said. Explain how the woman who sacrificed her financial security to help strangers ended up scrubbing floors while her only child lives in luxury. She's independent, Marcus said. She wanted to handle things herself. Did she? Daniel looked at me. Meredith, when you lost your house, when your business failed, did you ask your son for help? I couldn't answer. The memory of that conversation, of Marcus's discomfort and Chelsea's barely concealed hostility, of being made to feel like a burden for even asking, was still too raw. She did ask, Daniel said, reading my silence correctly. And what happened? Marcus looked away, unable to meet either of our eyes. Let me guess, Daniel continued, his voice getting colder. It was complicated. You had your own responsibilities. Maybe your wife had concerns about enabling dependency. Maybe you thought tough love would be better for her in the long run. Stop, Marcus said. Just stop. You know what I think? Daniel stood up, towering over my son. I think you were embarrassed. I think your mother's struggles didn't fit with the image you were trying to project. I think you found it easier to let her fade into the background than to deal with the inconvenience of helping her. That's enough, Marcus snapped. You don't know anything about our family. I know enough, Daniel shot back. I know that the woman who saved my life, who changed the course of hundreds of other lives, who gave up her own security to help kids she'd never even met, is sitting in your kitchen eating reheated turkey on Thanksgiving because you couldn't be bothered to wait for her. The two men stared at each other across the expensive office, the tension crackling between them like electricity. I felt caught in the middle, torn between my love for my son and my growing realization that Daniel was right about everything. You want to know why I really came here tonight? Daniel said finally, his voice quieter but no less intense. It wasn't just to thank Meredith, though God knows she deserves more gratitude than I could ever express. I came here because I have a proposition for her. He turned back to me, his expression softening. Meredith, I want you to come work for me. Not as a favor, not as charity, but because I need someone with your skills and your heart. Someone who understands what we're trying to do, who's lived it from both sides. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. Work for you? Director of Community Outreach for Morrison, Keller and Associates. You'd oversee our educational programs, coordinate with schools and community centers, help identify kids who need our services. It's what you were born to do. Danny, I haven't worked in that field for years. I wouldn't even know where to start. You'd start exactly where you always have, he said, by caring about kids who need someone to believe in them. The rest we can figure out together. Marcus was looking back and forth between us like he was watching a tennis match. Mom, you don't have to… Don't have to what? Daniel interrupted. Don't have to take a job that would give her purpose and dignity. Don't have to work with people who value her contributions. Don't have to escape the life of servitude you've allowed her to fall into. I never allowed anything, Marcus protested. She made her own choices. And when those choices led to consequences, when she needed support, what did you do? Daniel's voice was like a blade. Did you step up? Did you honor the woman who raised you, who sacrificed everything for your future? Or did you let your wife convince you that helping your own mother was somehow beneath you? Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. In that silence, I could hear the truth echoing louder than any argument. The job comes with a full benefits package, Daniel continued, speaking to me now. Health insurance, retirement contributions, 4 weeks of vacation. The salary is $90,000 a year to start, with performance bonuses and advancement opportunities. $90,000, more than I'd made in the last 3 years combined. More than enough to live with dignity, to stop scrubbing other people's floors, to maybe even start rebuilding some kind of future. You don't have to answer now, Daniel said gently. Think about it. But Meredith, please consider the possibility that this is why our paths crossed again tonight. Maybe it's time to stop punishing yourself for being generous. Time to start letting other people invest in you the way you've invested in so many others. Before I could respond, the study door burst open and Chelsea appeared, her face bright with the kind of aggressive cheerfulness that meant she was managing a crisis. Sorry to interrupt, she said, though her tone suggested she wasn't sorry at all. But Mr. Morrison, I just realized we haven't properly introduced ourselves. I'm Chelsea Chapman, Marcus's wife. She extended her hand with a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. Daniel shook it politely, but I could see the assessment in his eyes as he took in her designer dress, her perfect makeup, her carefully calculated presentation. Pleasure to meet you, he said neutrally. I couldn't help but overhear some of your conversation, Chelsea continued, her voice carrying that dangerous sweetness that I'd learned to fear. Something about a job offer? How exciting for Mary. Mary! The diminutive she'd always used for my name, making me sound like a family pet rather than a person with dignity and history. It is exciting, Daniel agreed. Your mother-in-law is a remarkable woman. Oh, absolutely, Chelsea gushed. She's so hardworking. Some people might look down on domestic work, but I've always said there's honor in any honest job. The words were perfectly crafted to sound supportive, while actually being deeply condescending. Daniel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I couldn't agree more, he said smoothly, though I think Meredith's talents might be better utilized in a position that matches her education and experience. Her education? Chelsea's laugh was like breaking glass. "Oh, you mean the library thing? That was ages ago. People change, don't they? Sometimes we have to adjust our expectations to match our circumstances. And sometimes," Daniel said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "circumstances change to match our true value." Chelsea's smile faltered slightly, sensing the undercurrent she couldn't quite identify. "Well, regardless, I'm sure any opportunity would be wonderful for Mary. She's been so independent lately." Independent? Code for, we've cut her off and don't feel guilty about it. Independence is admirable, Daniel agreed, though I've always believed families should be interdependent. Supporting each other, celebrating each other's successes, making sure no one gets left behind. The comment hung in the air like a challenge. Chelsea's eyes narrowed slightly as she tried to figure out if she was being criticized. "Of course," she said carefully. "Family is everything." "Yes," Daniel said, looking directly at Marcus. "It is." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I could see Chelsea's mind working, trying to understand the dynamic she'd walked into, trying to figure out why this stranger was looking at her husband like he'd found him lacking. "Well," she said finally, "I should let you get back to your catching up. Dinner was lovely, but I think some of our guests are getting ready to leave. The storm, you know." The storm outside had intensified while we'd been talking, the wind howling like something alive and furious. Through the study window, I could see snow whipping horizontally across their perfectly manicured lawn, erasing all traces of the civilized world Chelsea had worked so hard to construct. As if summoned by the weather, several of their dinner guests began appearing in the hallway, bundled in expensive coats and making apologetic noises about needing to leave before the roads became completely impassable. I watched through the open study door as Chelsea transformed into the perfect hostess, all concerned smiles and gracious farewells, pressing leftover containers into their hands and making them promise to text when they arrived home safely. But I caught the relief in her voice, the eagerness to have her controlled environment restored to order. The unexpected arrival of Daniel Morrison had clearly thrown her off balance, and having fewer variables to manage would help her regain her footing. Marcus stood awkwardly in the doorway, caught between his duties as host and the conversation that had been unfolding in the study. I could see the conflict written across his face, the growing realization that the narrative he'd constructed about his mother and their relationship was being challenged in ways he wasn't prepared to handle. "I should help with the guests," he said finally, though his eyes kept darting between Daniel and me like he was afraid of what might happen if he left us alone again. "Of course," Daniel said smoothly. "Family obligations come first." The irony in his tone was subtle but unmistakable, and I saw Marcus flinch slightly before he turned and walked away. Daniel closed the study door again, sealing us back into our bubble of honesty and uncomfortable truths. "He's struggling," I said quietly, though I wasn't sure if I was defending Marcus or simply acknowledging reality. "He should be struggling," Daniel replied, settling back into his chair. "Comfortable people rarely examine their choices until something forces them to. You're being very hard on him." "Am I?" Daniel leaned forward, his expression serious. "Meredith, let me ask you something. In all the years you've known me, even as an angry teenager, have you ever seen me be cruel just for the sake of it? I thought about the Danny I'd known, the boy who'd been sharp-tongued and defensive but never truly mean-spirited. Even at his angriest, his rage had been directed at systems and circumstances, not at individuals who didn't deserve it." "No," I admitted. "You were never cruel." "Then trust me when I say that what I'm doing here isn't about cruelty. It's about clarity. Sometimes people need to see themselves clearly before they can choose to be better." From the front hallway, we could hear the sounds of departure. Car doors slamming, engines starting reluctantly in the cold, the gradual exodus of Chelsea's carefully curated guest list. The house was slowly emptying, leaving just the four of us to navigate the emotional minefield that had been laid bare. "Tell me about the job," I said, needing to focus on something concrete, something that felt like a lifeline rather than a judgment. "You can't seriously be offering me a position just because we knew each other decades ago." Daniel's expression shifted, becoming more businesslike but no less warm. Actually, I've been researching you for months, remember? I know about your educational background, your work history, your community involvement. I know about the literacy programs you developed at 3 different libraries, the mentorship initiatives you started, the advocacy work you did for underfunded schools. That was all a long time ago. Skills don't expire, Meredith. Compassion doesn't have a shelf life. And frankly, most of the people I interview for positions like this have impressive resumes, but no real understanding of what it means to struggle. You've lived both sides of this equation. You've been the helper and the one who needed help. That's invaluable. I felt a flutter of something I'd almost forgotten. Hope, maybe. Or the memory of what it felt like to be valued for something other than my ability to clean bathrooms efficiently. What would I actually be doing? I asked. Building bridges, he said simply, between our legal services and the communities that need them most. You'd work with schools to identify kids who are falling through the cracks, coordinate with social services to make sure families know what resources are available, develop programs that address the root causes of the problems we see in court. He pulled another folder from his briefcase, this one filled with program descriptions and organizational charts. We have offices in Chicago, Milwaukee, and Indianapolis now, with plans to expand into Detroit and Cleveland within the next 2 years. Each office has a community outreach director, and they're some of our most important staff members. I flipped through the materials, seeing photographs of after-school programs, family advocacy centers, educational workshops, young people who looked like the kids I'd worked with at Millfield, but with hope in their eyes instead of anger. This girl, Daniel said, pointing to a photograph of a teenage Latina in graduation robes, Maria Santos. She came to us 3 years ago facing deportation with her family. Her parents had been working without proper documentation, and ICE was trying to separate them. Our legal team fought the case, but Maria was failing in school because of the stress, acting out, getting into trouble. He turned the page to show me more photos. Maria in a cap and gown, Maria shaking hands with someone in a business suit, Maria standing in front of a college campus. Our community outreach director in Chicago, Sarah Chen, worked with Maria's school to get her into counseling, tutoring, college prep programs. She graduated valedictorian last spring and just started her freshman year at Northwestern on a full scholarship. She wants to be an immigration lawyer. The story hit me like a physical blow, reminding me of all the kids I'd worked with over the years, all the potential I'd seen that never got the support it needed to flourish. How many Marias are there? I asked. Hundreds, Daniel said. Maybe thousands. Kids who have the intelligence and drive to succeed, but are trapped by circumstances beyond their control. Families who are one crisis away from falling apart but don't know how to access the help that's available. And you think I could make a difference in that? I know you could. His voice was absolutely certain. You already have made a difference, Meredith. Every scholarship recipient from your foundation. Every kid who got a second chance because you believed in the possibility of redemption. The ripple effects of what you've done are still spreading. Before I could respond, the study door opened again. This time it was Marcus alone, looking haggard and uncertain. The confident host of an hour ago had been replaced by a man who seemed to be questioning everything he thought he knew about his life. The guests are gone, he said unnecessarily. Chelsea's cleaning up. Daniel and I both nodded, waiting for him to say whatever had brought him back to the study. Marcus closed the door and leaned against it, running his hands through his hair in a gesture I remembered from his childhood, something he'd always done when he was overwhelmed. I need to understand something, he said finally. This foundation, this scholarship program you've been running, how long has it been going on? Since your father died, I said quietly. 7 years. And you never told me. No. Why? The question came out raw, almost desperate. Why would you keep something like that secret from your own son? I looked at this man I'd raised, trying to find the words that would help him understand a decision that had seemed so clear at the time but now felt impossibly complicated. Because I knew you'd try to stop me, I said finally. Because I knew you'd think it was irresponsible. that I should be securing my own future instead of helping strangers. Because I knew you'd inherited your father's practical streak, and you'd see it as throwing money away. Marcus stared at me like I was speaking a foreign language. But it was Dad's life insurance money. It was supposed to take care of you. It did take care of me, I said firmly. Just not in the way you think. Marcus, do you have any idea what it's like to lose everything? Your husband, your sense of purpose, your identity. I was drowning in grief and loneliness, and the only thing that kept me afloat was knowing that David's death could still create something good in the world. But you lost your house. Your business. You ended up... He gestured helplessly, unable to finish the sentence. I ended up exactly where I needed to be. I said, though even as I spoke the words, I wondered if they were really true. I learned what it means to struggle, to depend on the kindness of others, to swallow your pride and ask for help. Do you think I would understand the kids Daniel works with if I hadn't lived through that myself? Daniel had been listening to this exchange with growing intensity, and now he leaned forward in his chair. Marcus, can I ask you something? My son nodded warily. When your mother lost her house, when her business failed, what did you do to help her? Marcus's face flushed red. We offered to let her stay with us for a while. For a while, Daniel repeated, and then? It wasn't working out. Chelsea felt like we didn't have any privacy, and Mom seemed uncomfortable too. We thought it would be better if she found her own place. And did you help her find that place? Help her pay for it? Help her get back on her feet? The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We gave her some money. For the security deposit and first month's rent. But we couldn't support her indefinitely. We have our own expenses, our own plans. How much money? Daniel asked relentlessly. $3,000. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Let me make sure I understand this correctly. Your mother, who spent her entire adult life sacrificing for your future, who gave away her financial security to help disadvantaged kids, who raised you alone after your father died, lost her home and her livelihood, and you gave her $3,000 and told her to figure out the rest on her own. It's not that simple, Marcus protested. She's proud, independent. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want to be a burden, Daniel repeated slowly. Or you didn't want her to be one. Marcus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. The answer was written all over his face. Do you know what $3,000 represents to my law firm? Daniel continued. It's about what we spend on office supplies in a month. It's less than what your wife probably spends on clothes in a season. It's a rounding error in your household budget, Marcus. But you treated it like a generous gift that absolved you of any further obligation to the woman who gave you life. Stop, Marcus said, his voice breaking. Just stop. I know I screwed up, okay? I know I should have done more, should have been better. But I can't change the past. No, Daniel agreed, but you can change the future. You can start treating your mother with the respect and gratitude she deserves. You can acknowledge that she's not just some embarrassing relic from your humble beginnings, but a remarkable woman who's made the world better through her choices. Marcus looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something shift in his expression. The defensive anger was still there, but underneath it was something else. Shame, maybe. Recognition. The beginning of understanding. Mom, he said slowly, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. For not waiting for you today. For letting Chelsea talk to you the way she does. For not helping you when you needed it most. I don't know how I became this person. The apology hung in the air between us, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Part of me wanted to forgive him immediately, to smooth over the hurt and pretend that everything could go back to normal. But Daniel's presence had shown me that normal wasn't good enough anymore. That I deserved better than scraps of affection and grudging tolerance. I appreciate you saying that, I said carefully. But Marcus, I need you to understand that this isn't just about today. This isn't about one bad dinner or one thoughtless comment. This is about years of making me feel like I'm not good enough for your life, like my love is something to be embarrassed about rather than treasured. I never meant to make you feel that way. But you did, I said firmly. And meaning to or not meaning to doesn't change the impact. It doesn't change the nights I went to bed wondering if I'd failed as a mother, if I'd somehow raised a son who could be so cold to the person who loved him most. Marcus flinched, like I'd slapped him. Mom, please. Tell me how to fix this. Tell me what I need to do. Before I could answer, the study door opened again, and Chelsea appeared with a tray of coffee and what looked like expensive cookies arranged on fine china. Her smile was bright and brittle, and I could see the calculation behind her eyes as she took in the emotional tableau in front of her. I thought you might like some refreshments, she said cheerfully, setting the tray down on the desk between us. It's going to be a long night with the storm, and Mr. Morrison, you must be exhausted after your ordeal. Daniel accepted a cup of coffee with polite thanks, but I could see him studying Chelsea with the same intensity he'd probably used to evaluate witnesses in court. She was performing again, playing the role of the gracious hostess, but there was something desperate underneath the polish. Actually, Daniel said, I was just telling Meredith and Marcus about a job opportunity that might interest her. Director of Community Outreach for my law firm. Chelsea's hand froze halfway to her coffee cup. A job opportunity? How wonderful. But her tone suggested it was anything but wonderful. I could practically see her mind working, trying to figure out how this development would affect her carefully constructed world. It would mean relocating to Chicago, Daniel continued conversationally. We'd provide assistance with that, of course. Moving expenses, help finding appropriate housing, that sort of thing. Chicago, Chelsea repeated faintly. How far from here is that? About 4 hours by car, Daniel said. Close enough for regular visits, far enough for independence. The subtext was clear to everyone in the room. Close enough for Marcus to maintain a relationship with his mother if he chose to, far enough that Chelsea couldn't continue to control and marginalize me if I accepted the position. Well, Chelsea said, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining her cheerful facade, that sounds like quite an opportunity. Though I have to wonder if it's really practical for someone of Mary's age to start over in a new career, in a new city. Someone of Mary's age. The casual dismissal was like a match thrown onto gasoline, and I saw Daniel's jaw tighten with barely controlled anger. I think you'd be surprised, he said evenly, by what someone of Meredith's age and experience can accomplish when given the proper support and recognition. Oh, absolutely. Chelsea backtracked quickly, sensing the dangerous ground she was walking on. I just meant that change can be so difficult, especially for people who are used to a certain routine. Some people thrive on change, Daniel replied, especially when it represents growth and opportunity rather than stagnation. The verbal sparring was polite on the surface, but underneath it was a battle for control, for the right to define who I was and what I was capable of. I felt like a prize being fought over by forces I didn't entirely understand. What would the salary be? Marcus asked suddenly, and I could hear the guilt in his voice. He was finally beginning to understand the financial reality of my situation, the desperation I'd been hiding behind cheerful independence. $90,000 to start, Daniel said. Plus benefits, performance bonuses, and significant room for advancement. Meredith would also have access to our educational assistance program if she wanted to pursue additional training or certification. $90,000. The number hung in the air like a revelation. I could see Chelsea doing the math, realizing that this job would pay me more than twice what Marcus probably thought I needed to live on. More than enough to build a comfortable life without depending on anyone's charity or tolerance. That's quite generous, she said carefully. It's appropriate compensation for the work, Daniel corrected. Meredith would be overseeing programs that serve thousands of families, managing budgets in the millions, working with everyone from school superintendents to federal judges. The salary reflects the responsibility and the impact. He turned to me, his expression serious. I meant what I said earlier about not needing an answer tonight. This is a big decision, and I want you to have time to think it through completely. But Meredith, I hope you'll seriously consider it. We need people like you. People who understand that justice isn't just about winning cases, but about changing the systems that create injustice in the first place. I stared down at my hands, trying to process everything that had happened in the space of a few hours. This morning I'd been a woman driving through a blizzard to eat leftovers, with family who barely tolerated me. Now I was being offered a career that would not only restore my financial independence, but give me the chance to do work that mattered, work that honored the life David and I had built together. "I need to ask you something," I said to Daniel, "and I need you to be completely honest with me." "Of course. Is this offer real? Is it based on my actual qualifications and your genuine need for someone with my skills? Or is this some kind of rescue mission because you feel sorry for me?" Daniel leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "It's real, Meredith. When I started looking for you months ago, it wasn't because I had a job to offer. It was because I wanted to thank you and find out what had happened to you. But when I discovered your current situation, when I saw what you'd accomplished with the foundation despite your own struggles, I realized you were exactly what we'd been looking for." He pulled out his phone and showed me the screen. "This is the job posting we've had up for 6 months. We've interviewed over 40 candidates, and none of them had the combination of education, experience, and genuine understanding of our mission that we needed." I read through the job description, seeing requirements that matched my background almost perfectly. Community outreach experience, educational program development, crisis intervention skills, bilingual preferred but not required. "We were getting ready to hire our second choice," Daniel continued. "Someone with impressive credentials but no real passion for the work. Then I found you, and I realized that sometimes the universe puts exactly the right person in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. Even if that person is currently cleaning houses for a living? Especially then," he said firmly, "because that person understands humility, understands what it means to do whatever it takes to survive, understands that there's dignity in every kind of honest work. Those are qualities you can't teach in graduate school." Chelsea had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, and now she cleared her throat delicately. "Well, this has certainly been an eventful evening. Mr. Morrison, I should show you to the guest room so you can get some rest. I'm sure you're exhausted." It was a dismissal, an attempt to end a conversation that was spiraling beyond her control. But Daniel seemed to understand that this moment was crucial, that whatever decision I made tonight would shape not just my future but my relationship with my son for years to come. "Actually," he said, "I'd like to discuss one more thing with Meredith, if that's all right, something about the foundation." Chelsea's smile became increasingly strained. "Of course. I'll just clean up these coffee cups." But instead of leaving, she began fussing with the tray, clearly hoping to overhear whatever bombshell Daniel was about to drop. He waited patiently until she had no choice but to either leave or admit she was eavesdropping. "I'll be in the kitchen if anyone needs anything," she said finally, her voice tight with frustration. After she left, Daniel turned back to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Meredith, there's something else I need to tell you about the foundation. Something I discovered during my research that I think you should know." Marcus leaned forward, his face tense. "What kind of something?" Daniel hesitated, seeming to choose his words carefully. "The David Chapman Memorial Foundation has been incredibly successful. More successful than you probably realize. Between the scholarship distributions and the administrative work, it's been generating significant attention in philanthropic circles." "I don't understand," I said. "It's just a small foundation. We help maybe a dozen kids a year. 12 kids a year for 7 years, Daniel corrected. 84 scholarships given out, with an average value of $15,000 each. That's over $1 million in direct aid, not counting the multiplier effect of those students going on to successful careers and helping others." The numbers were staggering. I'd never added them up that way, never thought about the cumulative impact of what had started as a simple desire to honor David's memory. "But that's not the most important part," Daniel continued. "The most important part is that your foundation has been recommended for a major federal grant. The Department of Education has been looking for small, effective programs to use as models for a national initiative. If approved, the grant would be worth $10 million over 5 years. I felt the blood drain from my face. $10 million? The application was submitted 6 months ago by the Foundation's Board of Directors. I assumed you knew about it. Board of Directors? I looked at him in confusion. Daniel, I don't have a board of directors. It's just me, making decisions about which kids to help based on applications and recommendations. Daniel's expression grew very serious. Meredith, according to the federal paperwork, the David Chapman Memorial Foundation has a 5-member board of directors. You're listed as founder and president emeritus, but the current chairman is listed as Marcus Chapman. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. I turned to look at my son, who had gone pale as paper. "Marcus?" I whispered. "What is he talking about?" Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it again, looking like a man caught in a lie so big he couldn't figure out how to begin untangling it. "I can explain," he said finally, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he could. "You'd better," Daniel said, and his tone carried the kind of authority that had probably made opposing lawyers think twice about perjury. "Because what I'm seeing here looks an awful lot like someone taking credit for work they didn't do and applying for funds they have no right to claim." The silence that followed was deafening. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside that study, the only sound was the ticking of an expensive clock and the shallow breathing of 3 people grappling with the destruction of everything they thought they knew about each other. Marcus looked at me with eyes full of panic and something that might have been shame. "Mom, I can explain everything. It's not what it looks like." But as I stared at my son, the man I'd raised to be honest and kind, I had a terrible feeling that it was exactly what it looked like, and that the evening's revelations were far from over. Marcus sat there looking like a deer caught in headlights, his mouth opening and closing without producing any sound. The expensive clock on his desk seemed to tick louder with each passing second, marking time in a room where the carefully constructed facade of a successful family was crumbling piece by piece. "Start talking," Daniel said quietly, but there was steel beneath the calm tone. "And Marcus, I strongly advise you to tell the truth. Because I have copies of all the federal paperwork, and lying to investigators about grant fraud is a felony." Grant fraud. The words hit me like a physical blow. My son, my Marcus, accused of stealing from a foundation I'd created to honor his father's memory. It was so far beyond anything I could have imagined that for a moment I wondered if I was having some kind of stress-induced hallucination. "It's not fraud," Marcus said quickly, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "Not exactly. I mean, technically, legally, I do have the authority to—" "Marcus." Daniel's voice cut through the babbling like a blade. "Stop digging yourself deeper, and just explain what happened." My son took a shaky breath and looked at me with eyes full of guilt and desperation. "Mom, do you remember when you set up the foundation? You made me a signatory on the accounts because you said you wanted someone else to be able to handle things if something happened to you." I nodded slowly. I did remember that conversation, though it felt like a lifetime ago. I'd been so consumed with grief and the practical necessities of setting up the memorial that I'd barely thought about the legal implications. "And you gave me power of attorney for all foundation business," Marcus continued. "You said you trusted me to carry on Dad's legacy if you weren't able to." "I remember," I said quietly, "but Marcus, that was supposed to be an emergency measure, in case I got sick or died, not so you could." "I know," he interrupted. "I know that's what you intended, but legally, the documents give me full authority to make decisions about the foundation's operations." Daniel leaned forward, his expression dangerous. "And you decided to use that authority to restructure the organization without your mother's knowledge?" "It wasn't like that," Marcus protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "The grant opportunity came up last year. Someone from the Department of Education reached out to us after seeing our success rates. But the application process required a formal board structure, audited financials, things Mom had never set up because the foundation was so small." "So you set them up," Daniel said, "without telling her." "I was trying to help," Marcus said desperately. "The grant money would have allowed us to help so many more kids. I thought Mom would be thrilled when I surprised her with the news that we'd won." "And in the meantime, you restructured the foundation to put yourself in charge." Marcus's face crumpled. "It was just on paper. Just to meet the federal requirements. I never intended to actually take control away from Mom." "But you did take control," Daniel pointed out relentlessly. "You filed paperwork that listed yourself as chairman of the board, responsible for all major decisions. You applied for a $10 million grant in your name, using your mother's work as justification. The work was always credited to her, Marcus said weakly. Her name is all over the application materials. As founder and president emeritus, Daniel shot back. Past tense, Marcus. You positioned your mother as someone who used to run the foundation, while you presented yourself as the current leader. I felt sick to my stomach as the full scope of what my son had done began to sink in. He'd stolen my foundation, the one thing I had left that connected me to David, the one source of meaning and purpose in my increasingly empty life. How long? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How long have you been running things without telling me? Marcus couldn't meet my eyes. 18 months, he admitted, since the grant application process started. 18 months, a year and a half of decisions made without my knowledge, of my life's work being managed by someone who saw it as just another business opportunity. What else? Daniel demanded. What other changes did you make that your mother doesn't know about? Nothing major, Marcus said quickly, just administrative stuff. I hired an accountant to handle the books, set up proper tax filings, established investment accounts for the endowment. Investment accounts? I felt my heart start to race. Marcus, what investment accounts? The foundation doesn't have an endowment. The silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus had taken my simple memorial fund and turned it into something unrecognizable. Something that served his vision rather than mine. Show me, I said, standing up on unsteady legs. Show me the paperwork, all of it. Marcus hesitated, glancing toward the door as if he might make a run for it. But Daniel's presence seemed to anchor him in place, forcing him to face the consequences of what he'd done. It's all in the filing cabinet, he said quietly, gesturing toward an expensive piece of furniture I'd assumed held his business documents. Bottom drawer. I walked over and pulled the drawer open, revealing a thick folder labeled David Chapman Memorial Foundation Administrative. My hands trembled as I pulled it out and began leafing through the contents. Federal incorporation documents listing Marcus as chairman and CEO. Investment statements showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in accounts I'd never heard of. Board meeting minutes for meetings that had never taken place, signed with my forged signature. Marcus. I breathed, staring at a document that showed my own name signed to decisions I'd never made. You forged my signature. Just on routine paperwork, he said desperately. Nothing that changed the actual mission of the foundation. I was trying to protect your interests. By cutting me out of my own organization, by making sure it could survive and grow, he shot back, some of his defensive anger returning. Mom, you were running the foundation like a hobby. No proper oversight, no strategic planning, no real growth potential. I turned it into something that could actually make a difference. The words hit me like a slap. A hobby. My life's work. My memorial to David, my way of honoring the kids I'd worked with over the years, reduced to a hobby that needed his professional intervention to become legitimate. How much money? Daniel asked quietly. How much foundation money has been moved into accounts your mother doesn't control? Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. It's not what you think. The money is still being used for scholarships. I just consolidated everything into managed investment funds to generate better returns. How much, Marcus? $800,000, he whispered. The number hit me like a physical blow. $800,000 from my foundation, moved without my knowledge or consent into accounts I couldn't access. That's not possible, I said faintly. The foundation has never had that much money. It does now, Marcus said, his voice growing stronger as he moved into explanation mode. The investment returns have been incredible over the past year and a half. Plus, there were some major donor contributions after the foundation got recognition for its work. What donor contributions? I demanded. I never authorized any fundraising. Marcus looked at Daniel, then back at me, and I could see him calculating how much truth he could afford to reveal. There was an article, he said finally, in the Chicago Tribune about the foundation's success stories. It mentioned the scholarship recipients who'd gone on to prestigious colleges and careers. After it was published, we started getting unsolicited donations from people who wanted to support the work. An article I'd never seen, in a newspaper I'd never spoken to, generating donations I'd never received. My son had been living an entirely parallel version of my life, one where he got credit for my work and control over my legacy. "I want to see the article," I said. Marcus reluctantly turned to his computer and pulled up a saved web page. There it was, a glowing piece about the innovative scholarship program founded by local businessman Marcus Chapman in memory of his late father. My name was mentioned once, in passing, as the, quote, former librarian who inspired the program's focus on literacy. Former librarian. As if my career, my education, my expertise was just background context for Marcus's philanthropy. "They got it wrong," Marcus said weakly, seeing my expression. "I told them it was your foundation, but somehow the reporter misunderstood." "Did you correct them?" Daniel asked sharply. "Did you call the paper and demand a retraction?" Marcus's silence was answer enough. "Let me guess," Daniel continued. "You decided it was easier to just let people think you were the founder. After all, you were doing such a good job managing things. What difference did it make who got credit?" "It wasn't about credit," Marcus protested. "It was about effectiveness. The foundation has helped more kids in the past 18 months than it did in the previous 5 years combined." "Because you stole it," I said, my voice rising with anger I'd been suppressing for too long. "Because you took my work, my money, my father's memorial, and turned it into your own personal charity project." "I was trying to honor Dad's memory too," Marcus shot back. "I was trying to make sure his legacy actually mattered, instead of just being some small-scale feel-good project that helped a handful of kids." The contempt in his voice was unmistakable. Small-scale feel-good project. That's what he thought of the foundation that had given meaning to my life for 7 years, that had helped dozens of kids escape poverty and build futures they'd never imagined possible. "Those kids mattered," I said quietly. "Every single one of them mattered more than your grand vision, or your professional management, or your investment returns." "Of course they mattered," Marcus said impatiently. "But think about how many more we could help with proper funding and organization. Think about the national impact we could have if the federal grant comes through." "We?" Daniel's voice cut through Marcus's justifications like a knife. "There is no we. Here, Marcus, you stole your mother's foundation and tried to rebrand it as your own success story. That's not collaboration, that's fraud." "It's not fraud," Marcus insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. "Everything I did was technically legal under the power of attorney documents." "Legal and ethical are two different things," Daniel replied coldly. "And I'm not even sure about the legal part. Using power of attorney to fundamentally restructure an organization without the principal's knowledge or consent? Filing false documents with federal agencies? Forging signatures on board resolutions?" A prosecutor would have a field day with this. The word prosecutor seemed to drain all the fight out of Marcus. He slumped in his chair, looking suddenly much older than his 32 years. "I never meant for it to go this far," he said quietly. "It started small, just trying to meet the federal requirements for the grant application, but then the money started coming in, and there were all these opportunities to expand, and I thought I was building something Dad would be proud of." "Your father would be ashamed," I said, and the words came out harsher than I'd intended, but they were true, and Marcus needed to hear them. David never cared about scale or efficiency or investment returns. He cared about people, individual people, with names and stories and dreams. He would be horrified to know you turned his memorial into a corporate enterprise. Marcus flinched as if I'd struck him. "That's not fair, Mom. You don't know what Dad would have wanted." "I know he wouldn't have wanted his son to steal from his widow," I replied firmly. "I know he wouldn't have wanted you to forge my signature and cut me out of decisions about his own memorial." The room fell silent except for the continued howling of the storm outside. I realized that my hands were shaking with anger and adrenaline. That I was having the confrontation with my son that should have happened years ago, when he first started treating me like an inconvenience instead of his mother. What happens now? Marcus asked finally, his voice small and defeated. Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying my son with the calculating expression of a lawyer considering his options. That depends on your mother, he said. She's the injured party here. She gets to decide whether this is a family matter to be resolved privately or a criminal matter to be referred to the appropriate authorities. The power of that decision settled over me like a weight. I could destroy my son's career, his reputation, his marriage, with a single phone call to the FBI. Or I could try to find a way to rebuild what he'd broken, to salvage some kind of relationship from the wreckage of trust and respect. I need to think, I said finally. I need time to process all of this before I decide anything. Of course, Daniel said gently. But Meredith, there are some immediate practical concerns we need to address. The federal grant review is scheduled for next month. If the foundation is going to be restructured, if changes are going to be made to the leadership, it needs to happen quickly or the application will be withdrawn. $10 million. Enough money to help thousands of kids, to create programs that could change entire communities. The opportunity of a lifetime, built on my work but stolen by my son. What would restructuring look like? I asked. Complete transparency, Daniel said immediately. Marcus would resign from all positions of authority and return full control to you. The forged documents would be corrected, the board structure would be eliminated or reformed with your approval, and all financial accounts would be transferred back to your sole control. And if I don't want that? I asked quietly. If I don't want to go back to running a foundation that's been turned into something I don't recognize? Daniel's expression softened. Then you dissolve it. Take whatever money is rightfully yours, shut down the organization, and walk away. Start fresh with something new, something that reflects your values rather than your son's ambitions. The idea of dissolving David's memorial foundation felt like killing him all over again. But the idea of continuing to work within the corporate structure Marcus had created felt like betraying everything the foundation had originally stood for. There's a third option, Daniel said carefully. You could transfer control of the foundation to someone else. Someone you trust to honor your vision while having the professional expertise to manage the federal grant process. I looked at him sharply. Are you offering? I'm suggesting that Morrison, Keller and Associates has the infrastructure to manage a $10 million federal grant, and the mission alignment to ensure the money is used effectively. If you wanted to maintain oversight and involvement while stepping back from day-to-day operations, we could create a partnership structure that protects your interests while maximizing the foundation's impact. It was an elegant solution, one that would allow me to preserve David's legacy while ensuring I never had to depend on Marcus's honesty again. But it also felt like another kind of giving up, another way of admitting that I wasn't capable of managing my own life's work. Before I could respond, the study door burst open and Chelsea appeared, her face flushed with anxiety and barely contained panic. Marcus, she said breathlessly, ignoring both Daniel and me completely. We need to talk. Right now. Privately. Chelsea, we're in the middle of something important here, Marcus said wearily. More important than the phone call I just received from your company's legal department? She shot back, her voice rising with hysteria. More important than the fact that someone has been asking questions about your involvement with the Chapman Foundation? The blood drained from Marcus's face. What kind of questions? The kind that suggest someone is preparing to file a pedophile complaint with the SEC about fraudulent charity operations. Chelsea snapped. The kind that could destroy your career and put you in federal prison. Daniel raised an eyebrow. That was fast. The federal investigators must have been monitoring the foundation's activities more closely than we realized. You called them, Marcus accused, turning on Daniel with renewed anger. You reported me before we even had this conversation. I didn't call anyone, Daniel said calmly. But Marcus, when you file for a $10 million federal grant, every aspect of your organization comes under scrutiny. If there are irregularities in your paperwork, if signatures don't match, if the timeline of your involvement doesn't align with the foundation's history, Investigators notice these things. Chelsea looked back and forth between her husband and Daniel like she was watching a tennis match that would determine the rest of her life. "Can you fix this?" she demanded of Daniel. "Can you make this go away?" "I'm not Marcus's lawyer," Daniel replied evenly. "And even if I were, I couldn't make fraud charges disappear. I could only help minimize the consequences." "Consequences," Chelsea repeated faintly. She sank into one of the leather chairs, her perfect composure finally cracking completely. "Marcus, what have you done? What have you done to our life?" It was interesting, I thought, how Chelsea's first concern was for their life, their reputation, their future. Not for the kids who might lose scholarship opportunities. Not for the damage done to David's memorial. Not even for the betrayal of trust between mother and son. Just for the potential impact on her comfortable existence. "I was trying to build something," Marcus said desperately, appealing to his wife. "Something bigger than Mom's little charity project. Something that could actually make a difference." "By committing fraud," Chelsea said flatly. "By forging signatures and lying to federal investigators." "I never lied to anyone," Marcus protested. "I just didn't correct some misunderstandings about the foundation's leadership structure." Daniel laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Marcus, that's literally the definition of fraud by omission. You allowed federal agencies to operate under false assumptions about your authority and your role in the foundation's success." The reality of the situation was finally sinking in for all of us. This wasn't just about family conflict or hurt feelings anymore. This was about federal crimes, about the kind of charges that could send Marcus to prison and destroy everything he'd worked to build. "What do we do?" Chelsea whispered, her voice breaking. "How do we fix this?" "We?" I stood up slowly, looking down at my daughter-in-law with a mixture of pity and disgust. "There is no we here, Chelsea. You didn't create this mess, but you're not going to decide how to clean it up either." She looked at me with genuine surprise, as if she'd forgotten I was in the room, forgotten that I had any say in what happened next. "Mary, surely you don't want to see your own son go to prison," she said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she used when she wanted something. "Surely we can work together to find a solution that protects everyone." "My name is Meredith," I said firmly. "And I don't want to see Marcus go to prison, but I also don't want to see him escape consequences for what he's done. He stole from me, Chelsea. He stole my work, my money, my father's memorial, and my reputation. That's not something we just sweep under the rug to protect your lifestyle." Chelsea's face hardened, the mask of helpless vulnerability falling away to reveal the calculating woman underneath. "Your reputation? What reputation?" "You're a maid, Meredith. A woman who cleans toilets for $3,000 a month. Marcus took your little hobby charity and turned it into something that actually matters. Something that could help thousands of kids instead of just the handful you are managing to scrape together money for." The contempt in her voice was breathtaking, but it was also clarifying. This was what she really thought of me, what she'd always thought. Not just someone beneath her social station, but someone whose work and dreams and contributions were fundamentally worthless. "You're right," I said quietly, and I saw confusion flicker across her face. "I am just a maid, someone who cleans up other people's messes. And right now, I'm looking at the biggest mess I've ever encountered." I turned to Daniel, my decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I want to accept your job offer. I want to work for Morrison, Keller, and Associates, and I want to transfer the foundation's assets to your organization's management." "Mom, no," Marcus said desperately. "Please, we can work this out as a family. You don't need to bring outsiders into our business. You made Daniel part of this the moment you committed fraud using my foundation," I replied firmly. "And you lost the right to call this a family business when you cut me out of it." I looked at Daniel, seeing something like pride in his expression. "Can your firm handle the federal grant if the foundation is restructured under your management?" "Absolutely," he said. "We have experience with federal educational grants, and we have the infrastructure to ensure complete compliance with all reporting requirements." "And the job offer still stands?" "It stands," he confirmed. "With one addition." I'd like you to serve as the Foundation's executive director under our management. You'd be responsible for program development and implementation, working directly with the communities we serve. It would mean a significant salary increase and the chance to build the kind of programs you've always envisioned. Executive director. Not just an employee, but a leader. Not just someone implementing other people's visions, but someone with the authority and resources to create real change. What about Marcus? I asked quietly. What happens to him in all of this? Daniel's expression grew serious. That depends on several factors. His cooperation with the restructuring process, his willingness to make full restitution for any funds that were improperly handled, and his truthfulness with federal investigators when they interview him. When they interview him? It's inevitable at this point, Daniel said gently. The SEC complaint has been filed, which means there will be an investigation. Marcus can either be a cooperative witness who helps resolve the situation quickly, or he can be an uncooperative subject who makes things much worse for himself. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. What do you mean by cooperation? Complete honesty about what you did and why, Daniel said bluntly. Full disclosure of all financial transactions, all forged documents, all misrepresentations made to federal agencies. And public acknowledgement that your mother was the true founder and driving force behind the Foundation's success. Public acknowledgement. It wasn't just about money or legal liability anymore. It was about setting the record straight, about ensuring that David's memorial reflected the truth of what we'd built together rather than the fiction Marcus had constructed. And if he cooperates, I asked, then charges might be reduced or dropped entirely, depending on the prosecutor's discretion and the extent of the damages, Daniel said. White-collar first offenders who make full restitution and show genuine remorse often receive probation rather than prison time. Chelsea was crying now, quiet tears that left dark stains on her expensive dress. This will ruin us, she whispered. Even if Marcus doesn't go to prison, the scandal will destroy his career. No one will hire someone who's been investigated for charity fraud. You're probably right, I said, and I was surprised to find that I felt no satisfaction in the admission. Just a deep sadness for the life Marcus had thrown away, for the man I'd thought I'd raised who had turned out to be capable of such calculated betrayal. But maybe that's not entirely a bad thing, I continued. Maybe Marcus needs to learn what it's like to start over, to rebuild from nothing, to understand what he put me through when he cut me out of my own life's work. Marcus looked up at me with eyes full of tears. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for all of it. I know I can't undo what I've done, but please, don't give up on me completely. The apology hung in the air between us, and I felt the familiar tug of maternal love warring with the need for justice. This was still my son, the little boy I'd raised alone after David died, the child I'd sacrificed everything to give a better life. But he was also the man who had stolen from me, who had forged my signature, who had let me sit in his kitchen eating reheated turkey while he entertained guests who thought he was a philanthropist. I'm not giving up on you, I said finally, but I'm also not going to protect you from the consequences of your choices. If you want to rebuild our relationship, you're going to have to earn it. Starting with complete honesty about what you've done and genuine efforts to make things right. Marcus nodded frantically. Yes, anything. I'll do whatever it takes. Then you'll start by calling the federal investigators first thing in the morning and volunteering to cooperate fully with their inquiry, I said. You'll provide them with complete financial records, you'll admit to any wrongdoing, and you'll make it clear that I had no knowledge of your actions. I will, he promised. I'll call them myself. I turned to Daniel, feeling a strange sense of lightness, as if a weight I'd been carrying for years had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. When would you need an answer about the job? The sooner the better, he said. We could start the paperwork tomorrow if you're ready. The Foundation restructuring will take a few weeks, but your employment could begin immediately. Tomorrow. Less than 24 hours from now, I could be starting over again. Not as someone's charity case or unwanted burden, but as a professional, with skills and experience and value. I'm ready, I said, and I meant it. I'm ready to stop being a victim and start being someone who makes a difference again. Daniel smiled, and for a moment he looked exactly like the teenage boy I'd helped save all those years ago. Welcome back, Meredith. Welcome back to the life you deserve. The storm outside was finally beginning to subside, the wind dropping from a howl to a whisper. Through the study window I could see the first hints of dawn breaking through the clouds, promising a new day that would look nothing like the one that had come before. I thought about the drive home I'd have to make in a few hours, through snow-covered roads that would be treacherous but passable. But for the first time in years, I wasn't driving back to an empty apartment and a life of quiet desperation. I was driving towards something new, something that honored both David's memory and my own potential. Marcus would have to find his own way forward, just as I had when he'd abandoned me. Chelsea would have to decide whether her marriage was worth saving if it came without the financial security and social status she'd married into. And I would have to learn how to trust again, how to believe that my value wasn't determined by other people's opinions or charity. But for now, sitting in that expensive study with a job offer in my hands and the promise of justice finally being served, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt hope. The foundation that had started as a simple memorial to David would become something larger and more powerful than I'd ever imagined. The kids we'd help would have opportunities I'd never been able to provide. And somewhere in Chicago there was an office waiting for me, a place where my experience and my passion would be valued rather than dismissed. I gathered up the papers scattered across the desk, including the federal documents that detailed my son's betrayal and the job description that outlined my future. The night that had started with a humiliating dinner had become the turning point I'd never dared to hope for. As I stood to leave the study, Marcus called out one last time, "Mom, wait, what do I tell people? What do I say when they ask what happened?" I paused at the doorway, looking back at this man who had been my whole world for so many years, who had become a stranger capable of casual cruelty and calculated theft. "Tell them the truth," I said simply. "Tell them you forgot who raised you, and it took a blizzard and a stranger's kindness to remind you. Tell them that sometimes the people we dismiss as unimportant turn out to be the ones whose love and sacrifice made everything else possible." I walked out of that study and into my future, leaving behind the woman who had driven through a storm to eat leftovers with people who didn't value her presence. In her place was someone I hadn't been in years, someone I'd almost forgotten existed. I was Meredith Chapman, educator and advocate, founder of a charitable organization that had changed hundreds of lives. I was a woman who had turned grief into purpose, who had chosen generosity over security, who had raised a son and mourned a husband and survived betrayal and loss. And tomorrow, I would begin again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.